of human proportion. Beneath it, dried blood, not fresh, but not ancient either. And that's when Ryder began to growl. Not the kind of growl that startles something out of a bush. This one was low, steady, and cold. A warning. Blitz stood rigid, facing the shadows, his ears perked. Mara looked around. Nothing. Not a squirrel. Not a bird. The entire forest was frozen. Jake scanned the tree line. Something's out there, he said, more to himself than anyone else. The dogs weren't reacting to a scent, they were reacting to a presence. Suddenly, a branch snapped, not near, not far, somewhere in the middle. Ryder turned sharply, stepping between Mara and the noise. Blitz mirrored him. 2 protectors, 1 silent mission. Mara's breath caught. What if he's watching us? Whoever did this? Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to because sometimes silence speaks louder than sirens. The sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows through the pine needles. The light turned gold, then red. And in that color, everything felt sharper, every sound, every heartbeat. The hollow wasn't empty. It was waiting. And whatever chained Ethan to that tree wasn't done yet. They located him just as the final rays of daylight receded below the treetops and the forest began to consume its secrets entirely. Ryder burst through a dense thicket and halted abruptly, his body tensing, his nose twitching as he looked towards Jake. Blitz followed a mere heartbeat later, emitting a sharp, startled bark sufficiently loud to shatter the prevailing silence. Jake pushed onward with Mara trailing behind, her heart lodged in her throat. She was uncertain what to anticipate, but it was not this. There, slumped against the base of an ancient pine, was a man, Ethan Cole. His body was barely upright, hunched like a neglected scarecrow, his arms chained behind the trunk, metallic links biting into skin that had turned gray from exposure. His face was pallid, covered in dried blood and pine needles, his lips cracked, one eye swollen nearly shut. The forest had not merely engulfed him, it had attempted to obliterate him. But he was breathing, albeit faintly. Mara let out a choked sound, somewhere between a sob and a scream. She ran to him, collapsing to her knees as Jake moved with a speed she had never witnessed in a man. He was already checking for a pulse, severing the chain with a rescue implement secured to his belt. And through the tangled mass of hair and blood, Ethan opened one eye just enough to see her, and then he whispered, "Buried." It was weak, barely perceptible, but it was enough to freeze Mara's blood. Jake leaned in. "What's buried, Ethan?" No reply, just a shaky inhalation and a full body tremor that indicated he was at his limit, not an emotional limit. But a life or death one. The chains were not haphazard. These were not some rusted animal snares or wilderness mishaps. No, these were thick, reinforced shackles, cold steel secured with intent. Someone did not merely desire Ethan's absence, someone desired his erasure. Mara pressed a water bottle to his lips. He coughed violently, the sound hollow, rattling from a chest operating on sheer will. And then he looked past her, his focus narrowing on something behind them. Jake turned in unison with him. Footprints, fresh, not Ethan's. Blitz began barking like a siren, loud and frantic, spinning towards the woods, his ears pinned back, his teeth bared. Ryder stood beside Ethan now, protective, unmoving. His growl wasn't loud, it was low, controlled, dangerous. Something or someone was still present. And observing. Jake scanned the tree line again, slowly drawing Mara back, positioning himself between her and the unseen threat. The dogs remained locked, hyper-focused. Blitz paced in short, aggressive circles. Ryder lowered his head and sniffed the air again, inching towards the left, tracking someone. They hadn't just found Ethan, they had interrupted something ongoing. "Jake," Mara whispered, "what if he wasn't the only one?" Jake didn't answer immediately. He glanced at Ethan, who was now slipping back into unconsciousness, still mumbling that single, horrible word, "buried." They weren't rescuing a lost ranger anymore, they'd stumbled into a web, one that stretched deeper than the roots of any tree around them. And someone or something was about to pull the next thread. Ethan was stabilized, but that did not signify an end to the apprehension. They were positioned on a precarious edge, one wrong move and the entire forest felt as if it might fragment. Jake had witnessed combat zones less fraught with tension than this. Ryder and Blitz maintained their formation, they sensed something lingering out there, something human yet feral, the kind that wears footwear but leaves no trace. Jake trusted the dogs more than any official insignia, and at this moment, they were on high alert. Back at the makeshift camp, Mara attended to her father's injuries while attempting to decipher his delirious murmurs. The word "buried" replayed incessantly in her thoughts. What did it signify? Who? Or, more chillingly, what? Ethan's fingers twitched each time she tried to comfort him, and his eyes darted as if he were still bound to that tree. Then Ryder moved again, no forewarning, just a shift in weight, a sniff of the air, and an abrupt dash eastward towards a dry, shadowed ridge. Blitz lunged after him, and Jake didn't even call out, he simply ran. What they discovered beyond that ridge was not merely peculiar, it was profoundly wrong. A wide clearing enveloped in silence. Not a single bird chirped. Not a breeze stirred. And right there, concealed by moss, timber, and the passage of time, was the collapsed entrance to a mine, unrecorded on any map. Jake crouched. That's not erosion. That's camouflage. Ryder began circling the entrance. Blitz paced behind, sniffing the ground furiously. The soil was disturbed recently. Someone had been here. And they weren't just passing through, they were working, transporting, covering something up. Or someone. Mara caught up, breathless. The dogs led her towards a torn piece of cloth pinned under a rock, a child's backpack strap adorned with a faded unicorn print. Her heart plummeted. Jake retrieved a small, blackened notebook from behind a loose stone. It was barely legible, but one page stood out, a hand-drawn map, arrows, symbols, and a name, Wallace, the sheriff. Jake's stomach churned. No way, Mara whispered. My dad must have found something. That's why they chained him up. He got too close. Suddenly, Blitz let out a bark that made everyone freeze, not panic, alarm. He darted into the mine entrance, barking louder now. Jake moved to stop him, but Ryder followed without hesitation. Both dogs disappeared into the darkness. Jake cursed under his breath and pulled out a flare. They descended into the mouth of the mine, the beam of light slicing through years of dust and decay. And then, in the cold silence, they heard it, a whimper, small, fragile, human. Jake rushed forward. And there, curled behind a broken crate, a girl no older than 10, trembling, chained to the wall by her ankle. Her eyes widened as the flare lit her face. She didn't scream. She just whispered, "Please don't be like the others." Mara fell to her knees. "You're safe now. You're safe." The girl collapsed into her arms. But even in that moment of fragile hope, Ryder growled again, deep and low. There were still others. And someone out there was making sure not all of them made it out. The girl's name was Lily, merely 10 years of age, yet her eyes conveyed a narrative that would overwhelm most grown men. Grime streaked her cheeks, her voice trembled even as she whispered. She had been subterranean for days, perhaps weeks, her sole companions the shadows and the monstrous figures that moved within them. Mara held her tightly as if endeavoring to supplant every particle of fear with something more potent, more secure. Yet this mind still harbored secrets, and not all of them desired to remain interred. Jake scanned the area, flare held aloft. The walls were incised with markings, some official, others not. Scratched in chalk were tallies, over a dozen of them. Jake's intuition recoiled. These were not mining records, these were names, or rather, the identities no one bothered to record. Ryder sniffed along the far wall, then halted. A series of boards were loosely affixed, disguised as a support beam. Jake dislodged them, dust erupting into the air, and behind it, stacked like shameful recollections, were crates filled with evidence, children's attire, personal identification documents, journals, and even a recording device with a fractured screen. Jake activated it. A man's voice filled the air, cold, methodical, discussing transfers and dead zones, mentioning routes, even a name. Wallace, the town's sheriff, the man they trusted, the one who had advised Mara to refrain from interfering in official matters. Jake's jaw clenched. So that's why no one was searching for Ethan. They knew he was gone because they were the ones who had made him disappear. Bury the ranger quietly, the recording hissed. Chain him if you have to. It was enough to make Jake want to rip the walls apart. But just then, a rumbling, soft at first, then a loud crack. Dust fell from the ceiling. The mine groaned like an animal waking from a long sleep. They were being buried alive. Run! Jake shouted. He scooped Lily into his arms as Ryder and Blitz charged ahead. The tunnel began to collapse. Rocks crashed, wood splintered. Light blinked like a dying heartbeat. Jake pushed Mara forward, she refused to leave him behind. It wasn't just a sprint, it was survival boiled down to muscle and grit. Then the floor gave out. Jake went down, Lily still in his arms. Blitz spun mid-run and dove after them, disappearing into the void. When Mara and Ryder made it out of the collapsing entrance, coughing and bloodied, the entire mine caved in behind them with a roar that shook the trees. Debris rained like judgment, and Jake, Blitz, Lily gone. Mara collapsed to her knees. Her mind raced, trying to convince her heart that Jake was too stubborn to die. And Blitz, that dog wouldn't let a ghost touch a child, let alone lose one. But all she could do was scream into the empty woods as the dust choked out the light. It felt like the end, until, deep inside the wreckage, a bark echoed out, sharp, defiant, alive. The bark pierced the silence like a sharpened blade, not just any bark, Blitz's, sharp, defiant, full of vitality. And then another sound followed, a stifled cough, human, alive. Jake. Mara's head snapped upwards, her hands scraped and trembling, her eyes rimmed with panic. But in that instant, hope surged through the fear like a beacon in a dense fog. She scrambled to her feet, staring at the pile of debris as Ryder barked once, then commenced digging with his injured paw, stubborn and furious. Emergency teams arrived within minutes, helicopters overhead, personnel on the ground, but they did not locate the buried heroes. The heroes located themselves. Beneath the weight of the collapsed mine, Blitz had curled his body around Jake and Lily, shielding them both. Dust choked the air, darkness pressed in from all sides. Jake could move little, but he felt the warmth of the dog against his ribs. Blitz was panting heavily but alert, alive. And in Lily's tiny grip was the dog's fur, her hands buried in it as if it were the last safe haven in the world. Jake whispered, "We're not dying down here. Not today." Above ground, Mara fought to make the rescue crew listen. She knew they were down there, her intuition wasn't guessing, it was screaming. Ryder kept digging, bleeding from his nails, refusing to stop. A medic tried to pull him back. Ryder bit the glove, not to attack, but to warn. "You don't get between this dog and his mission." And then another bark, closer. Rescuers zeroed in, clearing the wreckage with controlled urgency, inch by inch, stone by stone, until finally, a shaft of light burst through. And so did Blitz, covered in dirt, limping but his tail wagging. Behind him, Jake, his shoulders scraped raw, breathing fire like a man who had just punched death in the mouth. He emerged with Lily in his arms. She was silent, her eyes wide. And then she looked at Mara and whispered, "You came back." Mara dropped to her knees, tears free falling. "We never left you." The crowd around them didn't cheer, they just stared. Because this wasn't some feel-good rescue story, this was resurrection, a man, a child, and a dog that had crawled through hell to drag each other out. But this wasn't the finish line. As medics tended to Jake and Lily, as Blitz collapsed beside Ryder, his head against his partner's like an old soldier finally home, Jake pulled Mara aside and handed her the damaged recorder. "Play it," he said. "You need to hear what they were doing down there." And so she did. The voice of Sheriff Wallace filled the speakers like poison, clear and cold, the Rangers close. He found the entrance. Make him disappear. Make it look like a bear attack or chain him until he dies out there. No one looks too hard in the hollow. Mara's blood went ice. And now, we're not just talking about survival, now we're talking about justice and vengeance and something far more dangerous than a collapsing mine, a man in uniform with everything to lose. One might assume that surviving a mine collapse, rescuing a lost child, and exposing a clandestine trafficking operation would mark the conclusion of the narrative. However, this was no fairy tale, and the antagonist had yet to show any sign of faltering. Sheriff Wallace, the very individual who had offered Mara a perfunctory pat on the back and advised her to trust the established procedures, now found himself at the epicenter of a tempest he had endeavored to conceal beneath layers of earth, apprehension, and silence. The team returned to town battered but breathing. Ethan, though still frail, was recovering in a guarded medical tent outside the ranger station. His memory was sharp in pieces, like shards of broken glass he was slowly assembling into something damning. When he saw Jake again, he didn't say much, just a single nod that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken thank yous. The Ranger's code wasn't words, it was action, and he'd seen enough to know who had his back. Meanwhile, Mara sat in a folding chair, listening to the full contents of that recorder. Her hands trembled as she scribbled notes, names, dates, drop points. Sheriff Wallace wasn't just involved, he was orchestrating it. He used his badge to shield an underground network that trafficked children through remote land under federal supervision. The hollow wasn't some cursed piece of forest, it was a smokescreen. And here's where things took a sharp left hook of a turn. Wallace showed up right there at the field hospital. Clean boots, polished badge, a calm smirk that made Mara's stomach lurch. He sauntered past the medics, nodding like he was visiting a bake sale. "Heard our Rangers back from the dead," he said with a laugh, stepping into the tent. "Figured I'd pay my respects." Jake was already there, arms crossed, standing in front of Ethan's cot like a wall with fists. Wallace eyed him. "We done here?" Jake didn't blink. "You tell me." Mara stormed in, holding the recorder in one hand, the printed evidence in the other. "You left him to die," she said, her voice low but pulsing with fire. "And you're still walking around like a hero?" Wallace didn't flinch. "That's a big accusation, sweetheart." Then Ryder walked in and growled. Not a warning, not a hello. This was deep, guttural, and full of judgment. Blitz followed, standing beside Jake. The message couldn't have been clearer. "You're not fooling anyone. Wallace's hand twitched toward his belt, where his weapon sat. Bad move. Jake stepped forward. Try it, and I'll make sure the cuffs are the least of your problems. Wallace laughed, but it was thin, hollow. He turned to leave and walked straight into two federal agents standing outside the tent. One of them held a warrant. The other held handcuffs. Turns out someone had already sent the recordings. Anonymous tip. Fast-tracked. And when Wallace tried to speak, the agents just said, "We've heard enough." They took him away without another word. But here's the thing about evil in a small town. It never travels alone. As the sun set over the tents and the dogs lay down beside Ethan, tired but watchful, Mara knew this wasn't the end. This was just the first domino. Because when truth starts falling, it takes everything in its path, including secrets you didn't even know you had. And the final chapter? Let's just say, some ghosts don't rest until the whole forest knows their name. Justice arrived swiftly, but healing invariably requires time. Following Sheriff Wallace's apprehension, federal teams meticulously searched the hollow for weeks. They discovered multiple burial locations, fragments of evidence, old crates filled with children's possessions, and in one sealed chamber, names incised into the walls. First names, nicknames, some with small handprints beneath them. Few words were spoken during that period. There was nothing left to articulate. Yet, sometimes, from that quietude, something more resilient emerges. Ethan Cole was relocated to a small rehabilitation cabin just beyond the forest's edge. It was tranquil, enveloped by pine trees, with a rear veranda facing the sunset. A place where a man could mend without disturbance, save for the gentle patting of four paws beside his chair. Ryder never departed from his side. Not even once. Even when Mara attempted to coax the dog away, Ryder would position himself at Ethan's boots like a soldier on duty. The scars on his muzzle had faded into patches of white. His eyes were weary but sharp. Blitz, meanwhile, had discovered a new purpose. The young girl, Lily, now resided with Mara, not as a foster placement, but as family. Her legal arrangements were expedited, approved within days of Wallace's arrest. No one contested it. They could not. Lily had not merely survived the mine. She had survived the memory of it, and Blitz had become her shadow. Wherever she went, he followed, to the mailbox, to the corner of the porch, even to bed, where she sometimes wept at night, and he would simply curl tighter around her until she fell asleep. Jake visited frequently, but his stays were never prolonged. Combat veterans bear their phantoms differently. He would sit on the veranda with Ethan, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing narratives neither man had previously disclosed to another soul. They never exchanged farewells. They merely nodded. That was sufficient. One morning, Mara walked outside to find Lily and Ethan planting flowers in the front garden. Yellow daisies, bright red tulips. The sun had barely risen, and the air was still heavy with dew. Ryder lay nearby, observing. Blitz was digging a hole with such enthusiasm it appeared he intended to tunnel to Canada. Mara smiled. It was not a momentous occasion, but it was genuine, and at times that is even superior. The media attempted to become involved. Sensational headlines, widely circulated video clips, but the family declined interviews. They did not desire fame. They desired peace. Mara did provide one statement, however, just one. It was broadcast on a small local station, scarcely noticed beyond the region. She said, "Some heroes don't wear uniforms. They have fur and teeth and hearts that never stop fighting, even when ours feel like they're breaking." That was the last anyone heard from them publicly. But the ranger station was reopened. The trail through the hollow was permanently sealed, marked with a plaque dedicated to the children who never made it out and the dogs who ensured others did. Now, every spring, Mara, Ethan, Lily, Jake, Ryder, and Blitz walked the forest together, not to patrol, not to fight, just to breathe. Because in the place where death once hid, life had taken root. And that's the thing about loyal dogs and broken people. Put them together, and they don't just survive, they save each other.